You're right. It's that time again. I'm so glad you're here. It's a coffee break show. Today, I have the coolest guest on, and we are going to talk about a topic that nobody has been talking about that she's an expert in. We're going to be talking about advertisers and sponsors for podcasters. Okay, but first, we always have to listen to music. I'll see you in a second. You're on the Success Secrets for Business, Family, and Life channel. This is the Coffee Break Show. Today, I have Heather Osgood on the show with us. This is going to be, I've been looking forward to this conversation all day. I see you guys jumping on. Do me a favor, put your name down below and become part of the conversation. Heather, welcome to the Coffee Break Show. I'm so excited you're here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here as well.
I was looking at your bio and looking at all the things here that were on the bio, and I was like, oh my God, she has over 20 years of scaling and starting and growing unfunded businesses, flipping them as well. Most recently, though, she started True Native Media. It's a podcasting representation agency. Now, this is so important because how many podcasters actually have representation with an agency? And they specialize in podcast advertising. And right away, that popped my eyeballs out, and I was like, okay, so here's her experience list. And this to me is absolutely writing the whole industry. Heather has years of experience in advertising. She started with radio, then she went to newspapers, then she owned a trade show company. And I know what it's like to have to get sponsors for these companies or get sponsors for trade shows. And so for over a decade now, she teaches podcasters how to get sponsors for their podcasters. And guess what we're going to be talking about today? We're going to be talking about that part of her expertise. Welcome to the show. Now, let me just ask you something. How'd you get into podcasting? How did you end up going from the radio to the newspaper to the trade shows to the podcasting, and what was the big hook that you like so much about it?
Yeah. So, really, when I started my career, I was in radio ad sales. And so I had to drive around my county, and I would probably say from end to end, it was about 2 hours. So I drove all the time, and I got really obsessed with audiobooks.
Oh
And
yeah.
so I would go to the library, and I was always into the self help. So I would listen to the Wayne Dyers, and I would
Me
listen
too.
to, how to win friends and influence people, just all of that kind of stuff. And I just really, really loved that kind of audio format. And as I progressed through my career, as you mentioned, I was in radio sales, then I went to newspaper, then I had my own trade show production company, which was essentially just advertising, but face to face. And when I sold my trade show production company, my husband and I were talking because it was the first time in my adult life where I didn't have, a bazillion things to do every single day after I sold my
Yeah.
company. He said, "Have you ever listened to a podcast?" And I said, "Oh gosh, no." Like I had remembered I had downloaded one where I had to download it on my computer and then I had to upload it to, at the time, my iPod and then listen to it. And I was like, that is just way too much work. I'm going to stick with my CDs, my books on CD.
Yeah.
And he was like, "I think you really should check out podcasts." And so I started listening to podcasts and I became really obsessed with the content because I already really loved that audio format. But then the more I listened, the more I was like, where are all of the ads? Here I am coming from an ad background.
Oh,
And it just seemed
interesting.
really strange to me that there were all of these shows that didn't have advertisers. And I really wondered why. And so that was really kind of like my first peek into the ad world, and in podcasting I just started investigating it, and ultimately ended up starting True Native Media.
God, that's so interesting. And I agree with you, Peter. It's so true, isn't it? There's so many podcasts right now that are sitting out there listening, all you podcasters that are listening and thinking, really? There's the possibility of advertising and sponsors. And I want to let you know, selling advertising, like for radio stations where you have to go to the business, that's some hard work. That's some hard closing skills right there. This is a person who actually knows the industry like the back of her hand, because, I've done that. I've been pitched by people trying to sell radio and newspaper and everything else. It's definitely something that is there. But now podcasting is getting so popular. The first thing I want to talk about also is that there are some skill sets that people need to learn in order to have good show sponsors, etc. I'm curious because one of the things I'm looking at is when a show has sponsors, what are the sponsors looking for? What are the type of shows that the sponsors want to be involved with? In other words, is there a certain amount of listeners? How does it evolve? How do you grow that? Because I can't imagine you just start your podcast show and then suddenly you have sponsors. I just don't see that working that way. And
Mhm.
what would you say to a new podcaster who's looking to build up to being able to have quality sponsors and advertisers?
Yeah, for sure. Well, so first, you always have to start with quality content. I know as a podcast host, most of us think that our shows are just stellar, but I would recommend getting feedback from other people. Have people listen to your show and really take that feedback to heart. So make sure that you are starting with quality content. And then, secondly, you have to have a level of consistency for that content, right? So it
Yeah.
doesn't matter what that consistency is. You might do a weekly show, you might do a seasonal show, you might do a show once a month. It doesn't matter what you decide on, but you need to pick a cadence and stick with it. So, really, I think those are the foundational pieces to getting sponsors, is making sure that you've got that. And, I listen to shows sometimes and I think, gosh, just a good mic would really help this show a
Oh,
lot.
yeah. Yeah, that's
Or
true.
better editing, so really, really be honest with yourself about the quality of the content you're producing. And then you have to really be very clear on who it is that is listening to your show. Because when we're thinking about advertisers and sponsors, the reason that companies want to advertise is because they are trying to get something from this relationship. And
Yeah.
most of the time, it's going to be that they're looking for new customers for themselves, right?
Of course.
Sometimes it could be brand awareness.
Mhm.
Sometimes it could just be alignment, right? Maybe you're in a specific industry and they want to align with you because you're a leader in the HR world with your podcast and they're in
Yeah,
the
yeah.
HR space. So that can be the case sometimes. But ultimately, you have to be super clear about who is listening to your show. One mistake that I really think that podcasters make is people will say all the time things like, oh, everybody listens to my show, all kinds of different people from all kinds of walks of life. And that really isn't helpful for you when you're trying to get sponsors, because
Absolutely.
if you've got someone who's interested in reaching, women between the ages of 25 and 45 who have children, who live on the East Coast, you need to know, do those people actually listen to your show? So make sure that
Love
you
it.
are running surveys to your audience and make sure you really, really know who it is that listens to your show, because ultimately that's going to give you the information you need to take to a potential sponsor to say, hey, I know you're trying to attract these types of customers, and I can bring those customers to you.
God, I love what you're saying. I think this makes such sense. It's interesting because everybody says, what's your demographic? What's your demographic for like a particular radio show? And the thing is, if you're consistent with your audience and you know who your audience is, you know who you're serving better, you know what the quality is. But more importantly, you have a little discernment as to the relationship with the advertiser you want to attract to your show. I mean, if you have, women who are moms, then having, a guy who's selling farm equipment to men isn't going to work. And I love that you said having that consistency in your content and quality content. Here's what I want to know, Heather, because I think this is the big debate right now. When I started my show, it was 5, 6 years ago. And so when I started my show, I talked to my mentor at that time, my coach. I worked with Joel Comm, who I really respect. And he said live show, over syndicated show, which to me is you record and you put it up, or you record and you put it up, you can edit it and etc. And I think the debate right now is, do we do live shows or do we do uh, syndicated shows? What, and does that matter to the advertiser? Does it matter to a sponsor whether it is a live show or a syndicated show?
Well, what we have to really consider is who is the audience that you're bringing that advertiser, and what exactly is it that you're selling them? So we are
Mhm.
selling podcasts, and
Yeah.
podcasts can originate as a live show, right? So like
Mhm.
in the case of what we're
Yep.
doing here, we're recording it live and then it's going to get republished as a podcast.
Mhm.
So, when we look at it, they're just very different things, right? A sponsor who's going to sponsor a live, video cast like this is going to be different than someone who maybe is interested in sponsoring a podcast. I will say, though, that ultimately what we are looking at is influencer marketing. And for me, that's the most important piece of all of this is that Vicky, people know you, they like you, they trust you. You're creating all kinds of wonderful content for them. And if you can get a sponsor relationship who's like, hey, I want to get behind your live show, I want to get behind your podcast, I want to get behind, maybe even some of the social that you're doing. YouTube certainly is emerging in the podcast space as being
That's
very
true.
important.
That's
So
true.
it really, I don't think that it should ever be an either or. Now, granted, in the content creation space, we could all just sit around and create content all day, right? Because there's so many opportunities for us to create
True.
content. So I do think you need to specialize. And if you decide that a live show is what you want to do because you like the feel of a live show, you like the spontaneity of the conversation, and that taps into you and what you enjoy doing, ultimately, I really believe that content creation is about the creator and what they like
Love
doing.
it.
If you hate video, don't do video. If you like audio, you want to be able to perfect it, do a podcast. If you like the live feel, do something live. So I really think ultimately it gets down to what you're passionate about doing. And then if you know that you've got an audience that's going to follow you, it doesn't really matter what kind of content you're creating, sponsors can get behind it.
God, I love this. I love this so much. I see you guys talking over here. I'm going to pop over here for a second. Hey, Peter, it's nice to be chatting with you again. I did the same thing in the 80s as an air broker, printer broker, creative TV commercials and CDs for clients and selling them to TV channels, radio stations, and the public. So you know how hard this is. You know what kind of work this is. Oh, thank you, by the way. I love compliments, and this is equally a good one. Sharing value with so many. Thank you very much. So, one of the things that we're looking at when we take a look at the future of podcasting, because I see the industry growing, and I'm assuming that you're saying that more and more people are subscribed to podcasts, subscribe, and they have their list of whatever. I know I do. But one of the things that I would like to know, because you just went over how podcasting is bleeding into YouTube and all the other forms, and whether it's live or it's not live, it doesn't matter. How's the content? How's the value? And where are you? If you don't like doing, I remember the first podcast I used Anchor. It was a
Mm.
free web app, and I used my iPhone 8 because it was that long ago, and I put my speaker into there, and I just did the podcast like that, and it was so clanky. And then I worked myself way up to getting, I use the Shure mics as well, the M7s is, and I look at all the quality of the growth that's been there. And I know some people think, don't start because I don't have the right equipment, or they think that influencer marketing, this is a big topic that you've been there, because I think the venue you choose is equally important. Like, I have no interest in TikTok. Have I been there and tried it? Yes. But I don't think that a minute there and having a big audience and 1 minute is going to attract a sponsor. But I think when I have a show that is out there on YouTube or on Pandora or iHeartRadio or inside a Facebook group, even, those shows can have stable audiences. And what I mean by that is I know what time I'm going on per day. I know when I go on, and my audience does too. Where TikTok, you're just kind of flinging it out. Here's a, 3, 4 times a day, and you may be just scrolling this way. I want to know what venue. I'm talking about audience building now. What I want to know is the venue for audience building, the platform, I think matters. And I want to know what's your opinion about building an audience, especially if you're a beginner, what the platforms are that you think are good places to begin. And just because there's a lot of podcasts out there doesn't mean you shouldn't start. I think the best time to start is right now to have your podcast. And I want to know, what's your opinion of the industry?
Mhm.
What's your opinion of the platforms that are great for podcasters and the influencer piece of it? Is there a place you need to grow as an influencer in order to have sponsors and advertisers see you better as a better show platform for them? Do you get the question I'm
Mhm.
asking?
Yeah, for sure. So, I think in terms of creating a podcast, if you haven't started a podcast and you're thinking you want to start one, there are now millions of podcasts.
Mhm.
And when I started 6 years ago, there were 400,000. So, the number has grown immensely. But one statistic that I always like to quote that I think is really important is that there are 600 million blogs out there.
Mhm.
And we all know people who have started blogs even like last year. Somebody will
Yeah.
start a blog and all of a sudden they'll be like, oh, yeah, it's going great. Like I've got this huge audience. And I'm like, who reads blogs anymore? Right. Like,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
people still read blogs and people are still building audiences. So if you're concerned that podcasting is oversaturated, I definitely am here to tell you that podcasts are not oversaturated. Starting a show today is really a great idea. And growing an audience is definitely a big part of starting that show. I will say, just like in any kind of content creation space, audience growth is not always an easy thing. And I do find that, oftentimes people have this mentality that, like, hey, I started a podcast. How come people aren't listening to it? Like, I just figured if I started it, I would get a whole bunch of listeners. I also have instances where people start podcasts and all of a sudden they come to me and they're like, oh yeah, we started the show, a few months ago and we have 200,000 downloads. And I'm like, what? How did you do that? But there are definitely different tactics that you need to take to market your podcast. And one of the things that I always talk about that I think is really important is that podcast listeners listen to podcasts. So
Yeah.
as popular as podcasting is, the active percent of the US population that listen to podcasts right now is only about 40%. Really, it's more like 35%. So, and those are people who listen to podcasts on a monthly basis. There are
Mhm.
many, many people who listen to podcasts like once or twice, right? Like maybe their friend said, oh, you have to listen to this Joe Rogan episode. And so they listen to it.
Yeah.
But when we look at active podcast listeners who are really dedicated to the medium, I would say that the audience is smaller than most people really think. So, when you're looking to grow your listenership, my recommendation is always to try and grow your audience within the podcast sphere. And what I mean by that is, be a guest on other podcasts, run ads on other podcasts, do cross promotions with other podcasts. There's different techniques that you can take that really do help you get in front of those podcast
Yeah.
listeners. And so I really think that that is the best place to start. Now, of course, it doesn't hurt if you've already got a great newsletter or if you've already got a great social channel that you've built up that's out there. But, think about it. When you're on Instagram and you're scrolling through your feed, if somebody said like, oh, look, here's a little, clip from my podcast, are you really going to leave Instagram to go and listen to the podcast? Unless in that moment you're like, oh my gosh, I really am interested in this show. Or
Yeah.
maybe you do see a show that you want to go. That is going to happen, but it doesn't happen as often as, oh, I'm already listening to a podcast and somebody talks about their show and I'm like, oh, hey, I want to go check that out. I mean, I've even had instances where I'm listening to a podcast. I like the guest so much. I would say this happens to me all the time, actually. I listen to a podcast and I like the podcast I'm listening to, but I like the guest so much that
Yeah,
I go and then find their podcast and listen to that.
that's right. I do that
Yeah.
all the time too. I'm so glad I'm not the only one guilty of it. Yeah, I love the things that are there. One of the and I just want to say this is what I like about doing live shows. And we have right here Sangar, who's listening in Kurdistan, north of Iraq. This is what I like about the Coffee Break Show. It's been very international. We have a huge audience. And Sangar, nice to see you on. Welcome back. And good morning, MJ. Nice to see you on. This, MJ, is the show right up your alley. This is just somebody who's going to do kind of the sponsoring and advertising conversations with us. So happy to see you there. I also like this right over here. Plus, the average person stops podcasting before they even reach 10 episodes. This is the thing. What she said earlier, the advice she's giving us, consistency in your content. You can win an audience just by this, because whether there's 6 million people that listen to your show or 6 million podcast shows, those shows that are going to rise to the top are the ones that are consistently doing great content.
Mhm.
I'm looking over here. However, there are more people looking on YouTube and hearing podcasts that stay forever for the listener to listen in the years to come, instead of Facebook, which burns content every day. It's really true. And I go live on 32 platforms every single time I go live, so that it lives in infamy everywhere, because that's just the fun of it. I like this. I totally agree with you. Then I try to get them on the show too. Yes, this is the thing about the podcasting world. This is absolutely. Oh, I'm sorry. We have Quebec, Canada on board with us today. Good morning. So you guys can tell me where you are and be in the conversation. Listen, you guys have any questions for her, you ask them, because I'm going to ask all the questions I want to ask with or without you guys. So we're going to keep going. And I think this is so interesting to talk about the expansion of podcasting, because you said something that was very interesting to me, Heather, and I want to go back to it. It really sparked my interest button. You were talking about the amount of people who listen, regular listeners to podcast shows. And right away, what happened in my mind is it's the type of listener that listens to podcast shows and why they listen. So, so to me, it's kind of like book readers as well. We have tons of books out, but not 100% of the population reads books. In fact, it's such a small percentage. You have to know who you're writing to, very specifically who you're writing to. So, I know that if I write a book to the general public, for the general public, it's going to fail right away, because the general public doesn't read books. You have to write to a specific group of writers. Now, is it the same thing with the podcasting people? Are they more more intelligent college graduate or college bound listener? Is it a younger listener who's just like, radio, what's that? Or newspapers, what's that? What is the demographic that actually listens the most to podcasts? Do you know that?
Mhm.
And do you know what kind of shows are they most listening to?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of great statistics out there about this. And if you're in the podcast space or you're a podcaster and you haven't checked out these studies, I would highly recommend them. So, Edison Research does the Infinite Dial on an annual basis, and it
Mm.
has tons of information in there about the podcast
You guys
consumer.
should be writing that down. It's the
Yes,
Edison, what is it?
it's Edison Research.
Edison Research. You should be writing this down right now. Go
Yeah,
ahead,
it's
Heather. I'm sorry I
no,
interrupted.
it's just a great study and it's got so much information in there. The other study that I really like is the IAB does a podcast revenue study on an annual basis, and it
Ooh,
is chocked full of statistics as well. But
IAB.
the IAB, yeah. So the statistics that you asked about that are important is who is listening to podcasts. And so when we look at who is listening to podcasts, the bulk of the listeners are between the ages of 25 and 45. Now,
Brilliant.
the interesting parts are, of course, the fringe, demographics, and we see that the older and the younger demographic are both increasing in listenership, which is definitely good to see. But really, still, the bulk is the 25 to 45-year-olds.
Brilliant.
And when I started in the industry, it was much more male. So there were many more male
Yeah.
listeners than female listeners. But that is starting to kind of tip. And I would say we're still not to 50-50, but we are getting closer to 50-50. So just about 50% female and
Cool.
50% male. And then, yeah, in terms of, the people and kind of some of like their qualitative information, they do tend to be early adopters. They tend to be more highly educated. They tend to be higher income earners. And one of the things that we touched upon here is the length of time people spend listening to a podcast. And
Ooh,
for me,
that's
I
good.
feel like that's one of the most interesting statistics because when we look at the attention span of society,
Yep.
myself included, right? We have very short attention spans. So
Mhm.
when you put podcasts up against really all other forms, whether it's, at the low end, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, on up into YouTube, people don't spend very much time. I mean, I think the average person looks at like 3 or 4 minutes of a YouTube video, but the average podcast listener listens to 85% of an episode, and the average podcast length is 40 minutes. So when you look at the amount of time that people spend with audio, it is off the charts in comparison to other forms. And really, that's why I think that there can be such a connection. And in my opinion, audio is so powerful because you can consume audio while you're doing other things.
Yes. Yes.
And who doesn't like that? I mean, for me,
I love that.
I walk a lot. I
Yep.
listen to podcasts and audiobooks. Anytime I'm doing chores, when I'm driving in the car,
Mhm.
all of those different things are really good opportunities for us to consume audio. And so the time spent listening with audio is much higher than it is with other forms. So not only are you reaching a very qualified, educated person when you
Yes.
are, creating a podcast, but they're really committed to the content you're creating.
And that I can tell you is an absolute. That is an absolute. I want to let you know, for those of you who are listening to the show live in your car, please drive safe, relax. Everything we've talked about, the Edison research, the IAB, the Interactive Advertising Bureau, is already on screen. You can go ahead when you're safe. Don't try to scramble and write it down. All of this stuff is going to be in the show notes, including her website address, because you know what's important about, I want to talk about the agency part of this. Everybody wants marketing agencies. Everybody wants the kind of agency that backs them up, that PR agency. And I think there's a specialty that you have cornered with the True Native Media that is specifically for podcasters. And I know that you've developed over $60,000 in advertising and growing. And if you're driving, relax. I'm going to put in her web addresses, and truenativemedia.com is already on screen. Thank you, Robin, for all the backup you do. I appreciate it so much. And don't multitask, drive safe. It's all good. But what we're talking about is we're going to be talking about what it is that you do, how you do it, how they can get a hold of you, what is the type of podcasting agency, because I think this has been a long time coming. And I think sponsorship podcasts is a great way to create an income source for the podcaster so they
Mhm.
can concentrate on delivering and growing great shows. So let's talk about that for a minute. Let's talk about how you developed your agency and what you do for people.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, and just to clarify, it's 60,000 ads, not dollars. So it's a couple more dollars than $60,000. Actually, quite a few
You
more dollars.
go, girl. That's right. So we're going to make that clear right now. 60,000 ads. Thank you very much.
Yeah, just wanted to make that clarification there. But yeah, so in terms of what we do, we are a representation firm. So what we do is we work with the podcaster. So if you're a podcaster and you're thinking, gosh, I really would love advertisers for my show, we work with you to find advertisers and sponsors for your podcast. And when we look at the types of shows that we're working with, audience size is definitely a factor. And I know that that's a question that most people have is how many listeners do I need to have in order to get sponsors on my show? And really the answer is that it depends a lot on how you're going to go about getting sponsors. So if you want to work with a representation agency like True Native Media, we're looking for shows that are getting over 100,000 downloads per month, doing dynamic ad insertion. But if you are on your own and you're like, gosh, I don't have that audience size yet, can I still get sponsors? I would say definitely the answer is yes. And really, it's just about how you're going about identifying those sponsors and getting sponsors for your show. But at True Native Media, our job really is to be that matchmaker. So we're taking the podcast and we're saying, oh, you're a true crime show and you've got, let's say 300,000 downloads per month and you reach 75% female. Well, Rothy's would be a good advertiser for your show. So let's get Rothy's over there. Let's get, HelloFresh on your show. So those are the types of things we do. But there are a lot of ways as an independent podcaster that you can also go about finding sponsors and advertisers on your own if you're not quite large enough to work with a company like ours.
I love that. I love that. Love that. We have a question from Peter. I want to put it up here. Heather, based on your experience, what's one of the things you would share with the new podcaster to be successful? Great question, Peter. Thank you.
Yeah, so I would say that the answer to that is quality, consistent content, which I know I've already mentioned, but I think that that's super important. And then next really is audience growth, because if you don't spend enough time really cultivating your audience, you're not ultimately going to get the traction that you want. Now, I do think, and I know obviously I'm in the advertising space, we're here to talk about sponsorship today, but I also think that it's super important for you as a podcaster to determine why you are podcasting. Do you have a podcast because you enjoy it? You like to create the content? Do you have it because you want to make money based solely on sponsorship?
Love that.
Or are there other reasons, right? And I mean, you could have an audience of 2 or 300 that are extremely loyal people who purchase all of the products that you create, right?
Yeah.
Your courses and maybe attend your webinars and your seminars and things like that. And that can be just as powerful as trying to get sponsors. The other thing is, a lot of times, just creating your own podcast gives you this ability to really create authority within your space. So, maybe you're trying to, get PR coverage for yourself in other arenas, and you can say, "Oh, hey, look, I've got all of this experience on this great podcast."
Mhm.
You also can get in front of great people. So I'm guessing, Vicky, you've probably had the opportunity to maybe interview people on your show that if you called them up and said, "Hey, can I pick your brain?" They would be like, Absolutely not. I'm not even going to acknowledge you, right?"
Sure.
But when you say, "Hey, can you come on my show? I want to interview you. I want to talk to you." Suddenly that gives you a platform to really engage and have those conversations. So,
That's
when
right.
we're talking about success, I think it's really important to determine what success looks like for you. And ultimately, that begins with your why. Why are you doing this and what are you hoping to get out of it?
This is so powerful what you just said, knowing your why. For me, when I started, I had no why. I I did it because I remember I was speaking so much in 2018 all over the place that I got tired of the plane ride. I'm tired. I'm tired. And I made it in 2019 my goal to not fly so much and do all the traveling that's required to speak on stages. And of course, then the pandemic happened and all the stages shut down. And so I started this podcast somewhere around maybe 2017, 18, something like that. And I did the show every day. And I was just talking, talking, talking. And somebody said, you need to add one day that you interview. And I was like, oh, that's crazy. I'll do that. So what I found was that I love the interview. I absolutely love the interview. And when I get brilliant people like you on the show, I can pick their brains. One of the things that I realized is I didn't always had to have the subject matter. I didn't always have to be the one educating my audience, that the person there is delivering value for you and you get to engage with them and set in great conversation speaking about all kinds of topics. And then I found the thing I liked. I don't want to go back out on the road. I love doing this, and I love the ability to talk to the audience, and I love the ability to share with us. And I think when you find your why, that you like doing this, it makes doing it per week, getting better and better. But I want to be honest, Heather, there's a vast difference in podcasting than there is in doing live speaking on stages. And I remember the very first podcast I didn't even look at the camera. I was just like looking out here because that's where the audience was in my past career. And I was just like, hey, blah, 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 blah. And you have to get some skill sets about interviewing with people and having a fun conversation. And I got to tell you, when I started, I had no course that I could take, no nothing. I just jumped in and did it. And I know that you actually teach people how to actually grow a podcast and get those things out. Um, yes, I love this right here. I'm going to pop over. I'll pop back to that conversation, but I just popped this from Peter and I liked it. It's a big difference between being a successful podcaster from a successful business in an agency or in a marketing and promoting podcasting. Yes, they're two different businesses and relevant right now because this is the medium that is growing. It's the medium. She said 25 to 45. Part of the difference between people now is that the podcast, the ability to listen while you work and do things and educate yourself continually, learning and growing and doing that is the business that's going to grow. I want to go back to learning skill sets about how to be a podcaster. So I am raw. I've never had that class, but you teach people to start their podcasts and their agencies in a way that they can grow the marketing piece with it in an agency manner. Is that correct? Do I have that correct?
So I don't teach people how to podcast. What we focus on is how to make money for your podcast through sponsorship. So
Okay,
we have,
that's a class right there that
yeah.
everybody podcasting, that's the one you need to take if you want to continue podcasting.
Yes, yes, yeah. So our course is called the Podcast Moneymaker course. And what
Right.
we do is we really just break down in the course what you should be doing to set your show up for success. So, what are the cornerstones of what you need to get sponsors, and then how to actually go out and find sponsors for yourself.
Brilliant.
And then we, of course, include all of the information you would need about how to create a media kit. What does a contract look like, so that you can do all of it on your own if that's something that you would like to do. Because obviously someone like myself, I've been in ad sales for, my whole career. And it's easy for me to sell ads because I know how to do it. But if you're somebody that you're like, gosh, I want to get sponsors for my show, I'm not large enough to get representation yet, but I still know that there's opportunities for me. The course can teach you how to go out and actually find those sponsors.
I love this. I love this, love this, love this. Finding sponsors for yourself. That's super important right now because sometimes if you have a local podcast that's in your area, like I know a guy who has a podcast in our area who does the weather and he
Oh,
does
nice.
the weather for the whole area and he's very beloved. Everybody listens to him, etc. But in that local thing, that local sponsorship is really, really good in that podcast area.
Mhm.
Um, I had something I wanted to pop back on that is, I think, super important for somebody who's continuing to grow their business, and that is you talked about this earlier, value and content, and knowing your audience and what you're talking about. So I chose the Coffee Break Show because I wanted a vast array of topics and a vast array of experts. It's been slower growing that because instead of zeroing in on a topic, I talk about golf. Welcome to the golf broadcast. I talk about everything that I can talk about as long as it betters someone's life in the long run for the conversation. And I love that particular platform. But I'm wondering, what would you say to a new podcaster when they're picking the topic that they want to talk about? Or maybe it's something they're passionate about, but what if you just want to start a blog just to have conversations and interviews with people? Which two, I mean, I know Joe Rogan is pretty much there, but he has A-lister celebrity people on his show, and you may be starting out in the little basement of in a podunk little town and trying to figure out, what should I talk about, who should I be on the podcast? And is there like shows that people are more attracted to right now that are based on certain niches or topics?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I don't want to be a broken record, but I do think that it goes back to your why. Why are you starting the podcast? And if you own a business and you're starting the podcast because you're trying to create more,
Awareness.
interest in your business, then of course the topic would be an easy, obvious choice for you. If you're in the dental field, obviously you're going to talk about the dental field. So I think it does depend why you are starting the podcast. But if you're just a person and you're like, gosh, I want to start a show, and I don't know what kind of show to start, maybe you're not sure which genre you would be interested in. Certainly there are topics that are going to be more successful. So comedy, sports are two of the very,
Yeah.
most listened to. True crime is well listened to. History, believe it or not, is really well
Wow.
listened to. Business shows are well listened to. And then everything else kind of, falls into the cracks. But financial shows are really very successful is another one that works really well. So, I think it depends on where your expertise is. I would say that oftentimes the shows that most people want to create that are not as successful, I don't think are oh, my friend and I just want to get together and just chat. Like, that sounds like so much fun. And yes, there are many, we've all listened to them, many shows where it's just a couple of friends chatting and we love them and we're very engaged. They just tend to grow a little bit slower because, like you said, like with the coffee break, I think it's incredible that you're able to have a whole bunch of different conversations. My podcast that I have is called the Podcast Advertising Playbook. And on that show, we just talk about podcast advertising. So number one, it's got a really small, audience of people who want to listen about podcast advertising. But then number two, it's kind of hard for me to find guests, right? Because I only want to talk to people who understand the podcast
Right.
ad space.
Yeah.
Whereas when you've got a really broad topic, you can bring on a whole bunch of different people. But ultimately, it does get down to the idea of when you're really clear about who you're speaking to, like you had mentioned a while ago, when you're reading a book, or I'm sorry, when you're writing a book and you're like, I'm writing this book for this person. In the same way, it's important for you to determine who you're speaking to. We have a very kind of obscure show that we work with called the Narcissist Apocalypse Show. And
Wow.
originally, he started the show as kind of a comedy show. So he was, talking about narcissism in a very comedic way. But he found that as he continued on, that he was getting people who were listening to the show who were really kind of the recipients of an abuse situation by a
Oh, of
narcissist.
course. Yeah.
And so his show really pivoted into now all of his guests are, many women and some men who come on the show to talk about their abusive situations with a narcissist. So here he was thinking he was going to start a comedy show, but
Yes.
ultimately the audience dictated that his content change. And it's really a fascinating story because now he's running support groups and doing all these things when originally he wanted to start a comedy show. So I do think that
Amazing.
isn't that cool?
Yeah.
I think sometimes your audience does tell you what they want to hear. One of the things I've heard over and over that I find really fascinating as well is that when you have a really good, co-host on your show,
Oh, yeah.
oftentimes your audience is just interested in listening to you and your co-host as well. I've had many situations where people will have high profile guests on their show and they think, oh gosh, I have this super high profile person. My numbers are going to just skyrocket because I had this person on. But really the shows where it's just them and their co-host outperform superstars sometimes. So it's not like there's just one specific path that you can take, that if you do X, Y, and Z, you're going to, just suddenly be successful. So when it comes to content creation, I ultimately think that it's important, again, to go back to why you're creating the show, what you're hoping to gain from producing the show. What is going to resonate with you personally? What do you enjoy creating? And of course, you do want to make sure that there's an audience. If you really, love to knit sweaters for your cat and you want to talk about that, you might not have as many listeners, right? As if you say, gosh, I I understand everything about history and I love to read history books. So I'm going to talk about this history book. The other idea that I just read about yesterday that I thought was really smart is this podcaster started a show, and instead of interviewing people, he brought on people to interview him. And so
I
his whole
saw
show,
that.
did you see that? I thought that was such
Yes.
a great idea.
I think I was actually asked to be on that or something, and I
Okay.
turned it down.
Oh,
What
yeah. But
I
I
think
think,
it was crazy, but I turned it down.
yeah, I think it's the idea sometimes, like, trying to infuse life into the show that you're doing by creating new ideas, because
Yes.
there are a lot of shows out there now that do feel kind of copycat-ish, right? Like, oh,
Mhm.
this is just a version of that show or a version of this show. And so I do think that it's important to kind of think about what unique approach you're bringing to your show, and that in and of itself can attract people.
Yeah, I love what you're saying. There's a couple of things I wanna add to that because I think one of the most important things about the show for me is I heard from gosh, I can't remember 'cause, I think it was Tom Bilal, I'm not sure, but I like
Oh, I
Tom.
love him.
I do, absolutely love him. But I think one of his guests said it. I think it was that show, and he said, "You don't always have to be all-knowing, but you do have to be consistently interesting." And I was like, "Ah, yes, that's the factor that I wanna work on. I wanna work on bringing and talking and asking and delivering interesting." And even if I'm not all-knowing, my expert guest is all-knowing. I wanna be interesting, and I wanna ask interesting questions or have interesting conversations. And I think that's a point where when you start the podcast, my 3 tips are treat it like a business because it is. Treat it like it's gonna build your credibility because it does. Treat it like it's a platform that's gonna help you build influence because it does. And what you said about the platform piece of it, I really resonate with. I really resonate with this. And I was watching a long time ago, I want to say 2016 or something, there was ex-President Trump had the show that was the Celebrity Apprentice, and
Yes, I
there
remember that show. Wow.
I was okay. So there was one, I saw a snippet where there was a talk show host that was super famous in the late 80s and the early 90s. And I know his name normally, but right now, because I'm on the show and it's live, I'm having a brain fart. Arsenio Hall, the Arsenio
Yes.
Hall show. And he was on the Celebrity Apprentice, and he had a task to do, and he had that list of phone numbers to call all the celebrity people that had been on his show, and he couldn't get anybody to turn around and call him back. And what he discovered was, he said, and this is where I absolutely, and why, one of the reasons I have a platform, is that when you have a platform, there are more people looking to be on a platform to have this kind of conversation. And if you have the platform for them, they'll be there and they'll answer your call. But when you don't have a platform, there's no reason for them to answer your call. And that struck me so smartly. I was like, yes, that's a benefit of having a platform. That's a benefit of having a talk show or a podcast or whatever you have as your show. And to me, I don't even call it podcasting or vlogging or whatever the word is. You have a show. It's a platform and a show. It's that actual business. So yes, thank you, MJ. It does have to be interesting and captivating. And so I don't try to be the knowledge base. I want to be a good interviewer, an authentic interviewer, and I want to get the best people with the biggest knowledge base on. That's what I want. And what I found was that I love the interview piece more than any piece of it. Nobody can take your podcast away from you. Once you've built your platform, it's yours. It doesn't belong to Netflix or ABC, NBC, CBS, or any other YouTube. It's your platform. You can have it everywhere. It's your show. You grow it. There's so many things you could do it. It is an absolute opportunity to grow your message, grow all kinds of influence and audience. And more importantly, it's a great way to grow sponsors. And if you want to know how to grow advertising and sponsors, you need to be working with somebody that has experience in all industries. Like, honestly, Heather is probably the most experienced person I've talked to. Over 20 years of experience in industries, working along with advertisers and sponsors to help them connect with the right audience. With, it's like, if you want to hunt for a sponsor, you want to make sure that you have the right sponsor with the right audience. And if you have an intermediary doing that for you, that's one less thing that you have to do. And what I want you to do right now is, I want you to go over to Heather Osgood .com, and in the scroll right there, heatherosgood.com, and notice what she can do for your business. You don't have to do everything alone. So this thing that podcasters are just by themselves with their microphone talking to people, blah blah blah, it's a business and it has divisions. And if you need that marketing division, you actually need to sit with Heather and say, this is what I'm doing, this is where I want to go, this is how I want to grow the business. And right now during the show, I can see that my internet is being wonky, but all you have to do is listen right now. And that is truenativemedia.com. True Native Media, go find that agency. And if you look at TV, they all have PR departments. For podcasting, Heather is your PR department, and you want to get to True Native Media. So we're wrapping up to the top of the hour, and we have a few times where you can ask her some questions. And Peter wants to share that the new way of learning in 2022 and the future is e-learning, audio, podcast, and YouTube. And I agree with that. And I think it's such an important thing to have. But in order to have audio, podcast, and YouTube feed you, you're going to have to find sponsors and advertisers. Your content on social media should do two things. that should add to your list and lead to a sale. And that is the best, some of the best things that you can say right now about the future of podcasting. I think it has done for me amazing things, and it's created amazing relationships. So inside, if they go to your site, which one would you prefer them to go to if they want to hire you as to learn about agency, or hire you to get sponsors, or etc.? And which of the two sites would you rather them go to?
Yeah, so our course is through heatherosgood.com. So if you're interested in signing up for the course, you would go to heatherosgood.com. If you're interested in representation, so if you have a podcast and you would like help securing sponsors for your show, truenativemedia.com is the best site to go for that. And there's a tab up at the top that says for podcasters, and you just click there and it kind of walks you through what it is that we could do for your show.
Fantastic. These are the times where how we grow our business requires that we have advertising, marketing, and we have all kinds of other tools outside of, here's my Facebook ad. Let's get professional. It is great that you have a podcast that's getting lots of downloads and people are listening to you. It's great that you have that. Now, if you want to continue doing that and, get to the point where it's feeding you and paying your bills, then you're going to have to look for sponsorship. And this is how it is going to move forward, that we are going to transfer. There's so much growth in the audio and the listening market over the last decade, so much growth. That growth is going to continue. There are multitaskers. They listen to podcasts when they drive, when they work, when they walk, when they're working out. How many people listen to podcasts when they're working out? So many do. But here's the key thing. The podcast audience is a wealthier audience. They're a more educated audience. And that is an identifiable group of people that you can sell to and grow with. That'll, be a wonderful relationship that you can have long term and have sponsors long term. There's nothing to gain but success if you implement some of the things that Heather has talked about today. Heather, I want to say I was looking forward all week to have this conversation with you, and it was super good. I'm super jazzed. And I want to leave you with I always do this at the end of my show. If you wanted to leave one message to the person who was working, who wanted to work with you, who was looking for you, what would you tell them? And what message would you give them to help them do business with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I would just say that if you have a podcast that has a very dedicated audience that is sizable enough, we definitely can secure advertisers for your show. So if you are thinking that it's time to monetize your show through advertising, we would love to help.
I think it's the smart way to go. And I want you to know you can find Heather at heatherosgood.com or truenativemedia.com. If you're looking to get some sponsorship, truenativemedia.com. Every single week I pride myself on absolutely bringing you the absolute best in expertise on subjects all around the world. I just want to thank you for being with us today, Heather. And next week, we're going to have another expert who's going to be absolutely fabulous. And we'll see you on the next Coffee Break Show. See you guys next week.